Greetings and welcome back to the Old Ways Rising Farm YouTube channel for a conversation that I'd just like to have with all of you that's bouncing off of a number of conversations that I've had with several friends here over the last month or so. And it's the idea of, okay, I want to build some skills, I want to build some resiliency, what do I do? And it's easy to start thinking these thoughts and then becoming completely overwhelmed by the thought of, oh my gosh, I don't know anything, I can't do all of this at once, there's so much to learn, I'll never learn it, right? And this could be small scale from, I'm starting an orchard and I feel like I need to learn everything, to large scale of, I'm involved in cultural revitalization project and I want to bring everything back to my people all at once, to medium scale, I'm having a farmstead, I have other friends, but there's so much we need to learn. It's really easy to get overwhelmed. And I just wanted to talk about that, about how do we organize our thoughts and not get overwhelmed? How do we be systematic? How do we prioritize? How do we work through some sort of structure? Some sort of intellectual structure, not physical structure, but an intellectual structure which allows for growth, development, improvement, but at the same time, again, helps prevent that feeling of overwhelm and decision paralysis. Right? Let's talk about that. Before diving right into the skills, I think it's important to talk about how we got where we are. And today, most of us grow up as skills orphans. Even farm kids, even if you were a farm kid on a modern farm, when it comes to hand tools and real traditional ways of living, we're still largely skills orphans. The extent to which a certain person is a skills orphan is going to have a lot to do with where they were born and where they grew up. You know, somebody who grew up on a farm is going to have less of a problem with this than somebody who grew up in suburbia, obviously. But to one extent or another, we are all disconnected from the traditional life. How did we get there? We got there from losing balance on the resiliency to efficiency spectrum. Right? That we lost balance as a culture. If you look at this, and I like to analogize this to plant pollination. I'm a botanist, so you're getting a plant story. Deal with it. If you're a plant, you need to spread your pollen, and you need to receive pollen so that you can distribute your genes and have the ability to produce seed, right? What's the strategy by which you do this? This is a really good, the different strategies that plants have for pollination is a really good way to think about resiliency versus efficiency. Okay, so on one end of the spectrum, we have the wind-pollinated plants, right? This is the oldest way of getting your pollen around, and it is the most resilient way because wind can never go wrong, right? You're never going to lose the existence of wind. If you do, you're on Mars. Well, even Mars has wind, right? Even Mars has wind, okay? So if you're using wind as your tool for pollination, it will always be there. But while that's true, and that gives a lot of resiliency, it's profoundly inefficient. You're just producing a cloud of pollen and it goes somewhere. There's no control over that. There's no guarantee that the pollen you're releasing will get to another plant of the same species. It will always be released and it will always get out. But does getting out matter? Well, getting out only matters if it gets out in a way that it lands on another plant of the same species, and you have no guarantee of that. So it's very, very resilient because wind will always exist, but it's very inefficient because it may exist in a way that's useless. Okay? Let's go to the opposite extreme. There's a large number of orchids, several genera of orchids, that have developed a relationship with a wasp, which is so tight and so specific that the orchid doesn't attract the attention of the wasp by producing a pollen and nectar reward. It attracts the attention of the wasp by looking like a female wasp and producing pheromones that mimic the female wasp. So the male wasp is tricked into attempting to mate with the flower. When it attempts to mate with the flower, a little pollen capsule bops it on the head, and it then flies off, is tricked by another flower, and exchanges that flower's pollen. Okay? This is extremely efficient because the flower drops a very small amount of pollen on a very specific insect, which is almost guaranteed to go to the next flower over, because wasps are not all that intelligent and are going to be tricked by the same pheromone game. Okay? So the orchid isn't trying to just fill its environment with clouds and clouds of pollen, the overwhelming majority of which is just going to end up in a lake or in the soil somewhere. It's very specifically plopping pollen on a messenger which is going to go to another flower of the same species. Extremely efficient, but it's also extremely brittle, because if the wasps can't fly, if there's a climate change and it's too cold for the wasp to fly, well, the flower's in pollen, no pollination happens. Or worse yet, if that wasp species ever goes extinct, that flower is guaranteed to follow it into extinction. So it's a very efficient system, but it's also very easy to break. Okay? Take the middle condition, something like an apple blossom or a sunflower, where it's insect pollinated, but it's insect pollinated by a wide variety of generalists. Right? Like the honeybee is a generalist pollinator. It's going to hit, while the apples are in bloom and the apples are the dominant pollen source, it's going to spend a lot of attention on the apples, so it's going to efficiently transfer pollen from apple to apple. But anything else that's blooming is also going to attract its attention. So sometimes it's going to transfer pollen from apple to pear. Sometimes it's going to transfer pollen from apple to dandelion. Okay, and anything else which happens to be coincidentally blooming in the same environment at the same time. But a lot of apple-to-apple pollination is also going to occur. So it's sort of a sweet spot where you have enough efficiency to be worth doing and to proceed well, but enough resiliency that if that bee goes extinct, if the honeybee goes extinct, we're not going to lose apples, because bumblebees will do it, and ichneumanoid wasps will carry a little bit of pollen, and flies occasionally will carry a little bit of pollen, right? So if the apple tree doesn't depend on one single pollinator, it's got a suite of friends that it can work with in this project, but trade some efficiency in doing so. We ended up skills orphans because we have gone the way, in modern society, we have gone the way of the orchid and the wasp. We've lost balance on one end of the spectrum. So we've evolved into this civilization where we're taught to master one skill, manipulate that skill into money, and then manipulate money into everything else that we need. And this is a very efficient way to farm human labor. Very efficient way to farm human labor. But it is not resilient, because as soon as something goes wrong in the supply chain, the whole thing falls apart. Yes, you still have your job, but you can no longer spend money on the things that you need, and you're hungry. Right? So it works as long as it works, but it's brittle. At the same time, we don't want to be, to the extreme of like the wind-pollinated plants, where we're trying to do everything and spread ourselves so thin across the landscape that we don't really accomplish our goals, and we don't accomplish a balanced life either. We want to find a mid-spot. So this is my first piece of advice in terms of learning skills, is think through, what does balance look for you? And that's going to be different depending on how you're coming to this. If you're coming to this because you're worried about supply chains, you're going to have one balance point in mind. If you come to it with cultural revitalization in mind, you're going to have another balance point. If you just want your farm to work better, you can have another balance point, right? I don't have a single answer for you, but I do encourage you to think about finding a balance, not trying to do everything, but finding a balance that works for you. Okay? That will automatically reduce the number of skills that you think you need to learn and help you focus your search better. Define those terms. What are your goals? What does balanced look like? Be ready for that to change as you learn and thought processes evolve, but start with an idea. Hold it loosely, but start with an idea. Okay? The second thought is thinking about this as a group project. If you're a homesteader, you probably have other homesteading friends. Okay? If you're looking at cultural revitalization, you definitely are doing that as a group project already. If you're just worried about supply chain, think about your neighbors and the conversations you have with your neighbors about that. Okay? And think about what skills you have as a group, not just as an individual. Right? So let's take the homesteading example, right? Maybe you have a friend who's a blacksmith. Maybe you have a friend who likes to work with fiber arts. Maybe you're a woodworker. Okay? So just as a hypothetical, right? So your friend who's a blacksmith and you can communicate about you helping him with woodwork and him helping you with tools. You know, and then maybe on your farm you have some sheep and you can work with your friend who's a fiber artist in that way. So if you already have those three skills, you don't need to focus as an individual on learning the other two because you have friends to talk to and work with. Have those conversations in a deliberate, mindful way, right? Talk about where you want to go as a community of three friends. And you don't have to be next door neighbors, right? You could be anywhere within driving distance, right? We live in the modern world. This doesn't all have to be next door neighbors that you can walk to, right? This could be a larger spatial group. But have these conversations in a mindful way. How can you work together to all be more resilient? Okay? And then once you've done that, think about what skills don't we have in our group. Okay? And those are the skills that you want to add in. Maybe you want to be a fiber artist, you want to be a blacksmith. But don't do that first. Look at what skills, maybe none of you know how to can. So then learn how to can as your next skill. Right? Bring that into the group. So if something doesn't exist at all within your group, that's your priority. Okay? Get that first. And then once you have all of the skills at the group level, then think about what you want to add to be personally more resilient and be a better asset to that group. Okay? Don't do any of this alone. If you try to do this alone, you're going to burn out, you're going to fail. Right? Do this as a community. We are social creatures. We need to do these things as community, period, point blank. Okay? So think that through and add those skills in. And then once you've thought about that and add those skills in at like completely new skill, the other thing you can think about is what can you do to tweak your own skill set and make better use of what you already have. And this is a concept of vertical integration, right? So what does that look like? Well, let's say you're the woodworker, right? We already said you're the woodworker, right? So you have a carving knife. Horizontal integration is if my carving knife breaks, I'll go buy one on an Etsy store, right? Efficient, but not resilient. Vertical integration is more resilient, right? So that's the idea of, okay, if my carving knife breaks, how do I solve the problem myself, right? So how could you? Well, maybe if you're really good at sharpening, you could regrind it and make a new carving knife out of it with a different profile and save the tool. Different use, but you've saved the tool, right? So if you are a woodworker, the first skill would be stock removal, knife making, and tool making, and sharpening. That would be the first step in vertical integration. So now you've gone from just a consumer to a modifier and a maintainer of the tools that you already own. Okay? The next step might be some moderate blacksmithing skills where you could bend and shape steel at a small scale, maybe not a full blacksmith shop, and deliberately buy a tool to make it into another tool. That would be another step of vertical integration. And then from there, becoming a full-fledged blacksmith would be another step of vertical integration. And then once you're a full-fledged blacksmith, then maybe you want to learn how to process and smelt ores so you can make some of your own starting material. That would be another step of vertical integration, right? Source your own fuel, source your own raw materials. So think about that, right? So if you're identified in your group as the one who's going to focus on woodworking, what other things can you do? You could maybe go up, and maybe buying a sawmill would let you bring more wood resources and process more raw materials for your woodwork. Right, so think about that ladder. I'm the one focusing on woodworking. How can I build that ladder and be able to be a more resilient woodworker, specifically? Okay. So that's something to think about. And then the third thing to think about is what resources do you have locally to use? So especially in light of, I think we all know after the COVID era that supply chains are inherently more brittle than we wish they were, right? So if there's a breakdown at that level, what resources do you have to work with? Okay. So where I grew up in Pennsylvania, there is no flint. So if you're looking at skill building from the perspective of I just want to do it and I just want to learn flint knapping, go for it, right? I'm a nerd. I collect these things. It's a special interest, right? It's my nerdy, dorky special interest to want to just learn things, just add them to my collection, right? So if that's where you're coming from, go ahead and do what I did as a kid and buy rock on internet auctions from Texas, ship it to Pennsylvania, and learn flint knapping. But if your goal is resilient lifestyle and you don't have flint, for crying out loud, focus on something else, right? You could fairly easily learn how to chip bottle glass into a semi-useful projectile point for hunting purposes. Quit there. If you don't have the resource, it's not going to add to your resiliency, right? Likewise, if you live on the tundra, maybe woodworking isn't where you want to focus, right? Maybe you want to focus on something else. So, I'm deliberately going to extremes here, right? So maybe if you're watching this from the Canadian high Arctic and you're sitting on a wealth of flint but no trees, the opposite decision is true. I'm obviously sitting in a forest with no flint. So woodworking and learning how to repurpose steel to woodworking tools would be very, very useful and add a lot to resiliency here where I'm currently sitting chatting with you. But if you're on the tundra surrounded by flint and have very little wood, it might be completely the opposite decision. So think about that. And do this mindfully. Don't just create a mythical, hypothetical world where you know how to do everything and then compare yourself to it. You're going to burn yourself out. You're going to stress yourself out. You're going to get perfection paralysis and you're not going to do anything. Sit down with your friends. Sit down with other people that are like-minded, that are coming to the skill building journey from a similar place. Think about these three things. What resources do you have? What skills do you already have? And how can you add to that skill set and vertically integrate what's already there in context? Do that mindfully, and you'll come up with a much narrower, much more reasonable set of skills that you want to bring into your little skill building family. And then you'll have a lot more fun doing it. So I just wanted to share these thoughts. I know it's big and broad in general, but it's a big, broad, general question, right? Everybody has a different context, a different set of friends, and a different set of goals. Sketch them out on paper, and you'll have a much better time of it. And then once you pick the skills that you pick, also embrace the fact that it's going to take a lot of practice before you get good at them. Be willing to do that. Be willing to pick a project which maybe isn't the finished goal, but will teach you the things that you need to accomplish that finished goal. Don't start blacksmithing with making fancy knives. Start blacksmithing with making fancy tent stakes. Right? They'll all work, even the ones that look ugly, and they'll let you build your skill set. Right? Just as a for instance. I'll make sure the fancy tent stake video is here in the end screen. just so you can see that if that is one of your interests. If you're learning to carve something which is going to work and do a purpose, even when it doesn't look great. That's why I did a whole duck decoy video series here. So if you want to learn carving, something like that, that doesn't have to be awesome, and you can still go and put in a hunting spread. Right, a lot of historic duck decoys are like two 2x4 screwed together with some green paint on the top. Right, and people hunted ducks over them. With even a little effort, you can do better than that. Right? So pick projects that allow you to venture into the skills, but don't have to be show off at the county fair perfect the first time. And that will help ease you into that process as well. So I'm going to end this little ramble there. I hope that there were some interesting thoughts for you here. I'll put a couple of the projects I mentioned in the end screen. You can look at those if you want, or go somewhere else and look at other projects, right? Go do the research, do the learning, get the ideas, and do all of this with forethought and a little bit of mindfulness, and you'll have a much, much better time with it. And I wish you all of the best here in your skill building journey, and I hope that you'll join us next time and follow along with ours at Old Ways Rising Farm.